I ran that. She had worked with me in the recruiting service, and I had confidence in her, and I tasked her to go do that in ARI. And lo and behold, she came up and produced this big study that shows we re-engineered the Stinger missile system and all that kind of stuff, showing what should have been done. And that led to two things. One, to take smarter people to do it. Second thing it led to was the fact that you ought to have taken into consideration the human factors to a better degree. Not the human factors associated with height and arm reach and seat reach and weight and avoirdupois and all that kind of stuff. Rather, what's in the head, which get at hand-eye coordination, mental agility, the ability to discriminate tasks, send it down to the motor system, none of which had been done very well.
Yeah.
Now, a guy in the civilian domain picked up on that, a guy named Marty Binkin, who is a famous guy over at the Brookings Institute. And Martin Binkin made a life then for the next 2 years criticizing the Army for having all these dummies in the Army who had come in 1978, 79, and 80 when Thurman brought them in, and now they wouldn't be capable of handling the M1, the Bradley, the Apache, etc. I mean, so there was a two-edged sword for doing that. Well, we began to lay down the base for why you needed smart people. See, we'd gone to the RAND Corporation when I was a recruiter and said, tell us something about smart people, and they said, what we find is that half the people are in the upper half and half the people in the lower half, and the upper half people are smarter than the lower half people, therefore you ought to go after the upper half people. And they charged us $300,000 for that particular survey, but we operated on the basis. RAND Corporation says it's good stuff, we'll go do it. Now, that led then to us then tasking TRADOC to say, tell us by MOS how many people, smart people, you need in MOS A versus MOS B versus 360 MOSs. So they began to do that. They began to say, okay, for infantry we need X number in the upper third, in the upper half, and we need Y number of Cat 4s, etc. So they had a big table, and then that enabled us then to go into the computer system and put that in the computer system as opposed to saying every third man. I see in 1980 it was every third man go into the infantry, armor, or field artillery. Take your choice. Give you your choice about that. But now we're getting refined, and we have tables that say, okay, we need so many people in the upper half, so many people in mental category 1, so many people in mental category 2, etc.
How'd they do that? To see their pants, or?
No, we ran tests down at the infantry, armor, and artillery school, and various schools around the country that began to take in these considerations about it.
So, I mean, they take a Cat 4 gunner on a tank and compare him with a Cat 3A and see.
Yeah. Find out he doesn't do as well.
And it really worked. I mean, it really happened.
You bet. So now these all take several years to go do that. So I mean, you set into motion these things, and they take a life of their own to get that done. But that led us then into getting the Army into man print, which says we got to get in at the front end of the combat development cycle in order to do that. Well, now there's a book that's thick on man print that goes to every industry code in the world, and you got to consider all this stuff when you build in your basic weapon system. Now, out of that review by weapon systems, I got very much interested in seeing to it that whenever we brought in a new weapon system, we would take it to make sure that we had the right people and the right MOSs in order to populate the new weapon system.
When they came off the line.
Right. And I made it a credo that we would never be embarrassed by having not trained the right number of people for any new weapon systems that might appear in the Army. Now, the first FAA I ran about that, which was, we call it a functional area analysis on manpower, functional manpower analysis, FMA, later changed to FAA when I get up to the device because I apply it to everything. But now as a desk spur, I'm looking at people only, and began to take a look at, first thing I looked at was artillery, because I was an artillery officer, knew a lot about the artillery, told the artillery commander, turned to and coughed up the functional area analysis on artillery. Tell me when you're going to bring in new howitzers or MLRS was a new weapon system we get involved in there, and I looked at a 2-year timeline. So I looked at that and said, my God, you know, we're short NCOs here. So I turned to the guy and said, well, how are we going, you know, the chief of my personnel policy over in mil percent, and I said, in listed matters, and I said, well, now how are we going to get this guy jacked up into getting a number of NCOs? And he said, well, geez, we can't control that because promotion boards control it. Well, you know, how do we control the promotion board? Well, that's done on number of points guy gets down there. Unit commander gets involved in all that. Now, a guy who was very instrumental at that time, 2 people, Don Connolly, who is now the DMPM. He'd been in recruiting command with me. He now is the DMPM, the Director of Military Personnel Management. And a fellow who worked for him at that time, a colonel named Jack Wheeler, later the commander of the recruiting command. But Jack Wheeler ran the enlisted side, and we sat down there and we said, well, gee whiz, we're going to spend some time now about figuring out how we change the promotion system. So I said, have somebody come over here and explain to me how we promote people from grade E7, or E9, E8, and E7 were promoted by central boards of the Department of the Army, so we knew how to control that. And I said, from now on, those boards will promote against vacancies by MOS. I mean, I don't need to promote any more cooks and bakers if I'm overstrength in cook and bakers. And we just start issuing those orders now. The promotion board E7, 8, 9, we control those boards, and we so did. I said, but look, grade E5 and E6 is different.
Was there any heartburn about this? I mean, was there anybody up in arms saying, my God, you can't do that, that's unfair, or equity, or anything?
No, you know, in my notion of exceeding my authority, in fact, I picked up a piece of paper about 6 months ago, wherein I wrote a letter to the Chief of Staff, from the desk to the Chief of Staff, that said, effective 1 August 1981, the following procedures will be invoked for boards grade E7, 8, and 9. You notice I didn't say,
I
would you agree?
Yeah, right.
I propose that you do this, or whatever. I mean, I look back on that now and I say, my God, I'd choke a guy that did something to me like he did that to me, you know. But Schreimeyer knew who I was, and, you know, he put me in there to work the desk for man. He didn't want to work it, he wanted me to work it. And so we changed that. Now when I got to the E5s and E6 boards, I called over, they couldn't explain to me how those were done. So I said, well, who runs this over at Milverson? And they said, well, there are 2 sergeant majors who run that over at Milverson. Bring them over here. So I said, okay, how do we do that? How do we run that? And they said, well, the way you run that is you give authority to promote based upon the total numbers that are in the Army at that grade. That is to say, if there are 100 cooks and bakers authorized in the Army, it's an authorization-based system. If you have 100 cooks and bakers authorized, you have 100 armor guys, 100 infantry, and there are 300 promotions to be given, then you'll give 100 for each one of those. And I said, well, suppose I already have 150 cooks, and only have 50 armor guys. What about that? And he said, no, you still give evenly 100, 100, and 100. I said, but I'm already overstrength in cooks. This will make me even more overstrength in cooks. Yeah, I know, but that's the way the system works. So I said to them, okay, we're going to do away with that system effective immediately. And you will go back and you will reprogram the computers, and what you will do is you will award billets for promotion by the number of vacancies in the branches, not by the number of authorizations in the branch. So if I'm short 50 armor guys and medics or cooks. The medics and cooks don't get any, and the tanks get 50. And they said, well, that's really going to be different than what we're doing. And I said, yeah. And I said, not only that, we're going to publish all the cutoff scores in the Army Times every month. And starting in 1981, they were published in the Army Times every month, and they're still published in the Army Times every month. The first time that that thing hit the field, cooks, medics, some mechanics, recruiters, their cutoff scores were like 990 on 100, on 1,000 rather. And infantry, armor, and field artillery cutoff scores were like 450. And suddenly, unit commanders in the field had authority to promote people who were serving as tank commanders at the grade of E4 to the grade of E5. Now, there was a feedback through the loop about that sergeant majors down at unit level said, well, these guys haven't been in the turret long enough to merit promotion to grade E5. And my answer to that, to all the commanders who hollered about that, was they are commanding the $1 million tank, and if they're no good, take them out of the tank. But if they are commanding the tank, then you must have confidence in their ability to command the tank. Now, which is it? Do you have confidence or don't you have confidence? Oh, we have confidence in them to command the tank. Well, so don't give any shit now about the fact that they ought to serve to the whim of some sergeant major down there for another 6 months or 2 years. If you got him on the promotion list and his point score is 450, don't be promoted. Suddenly, the Army began to raise the number of NCOs went up. Okay, about that time, guy comes up to me from down in the bowels of my system and says, hey, gee whiz, we haven't got enough money to pay the NCOs. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you know, with all your acumen in the PA&E game, you may have forgotten that we never budgeted to pay all the NCOs. We always knew that there was slop in the system down there, so we always would take out about 10,000 NCOs, so we never budgeted the right number of NCOs. So, well, we are going to budget it now, and you got to figure out how we're going to budget the money. So we got the money and we put it in there. And so suddenly, NCOs who went to Germany and spent 2 years on an unaccompanied tour because their wives were ground off about going back and forth to Germany all the time, and would come back to the United States and go back in 11 months to Germany or 13 months to Germany. Suddenly they came back and somebody said, geez, Sarge, you're going to be here for about 2 years now. Boy, family morale began to pick up then. People said, ha, I think I'll re-enlist. So re-enlistment rates began to go up and all that kind of stuff. So I asked those two sergeant majors later on, I said, I mean, we spent, like I'd looked after the recruiting malpractice on Saturdays and Sundays. I looked after this kind of stuff on Saturdays and Sundays, the systems inside this firm. So there were notorious sessions in there on Saturdays and Sundays and all that kind of stuff. But I always charged up for work for the guys in the field. And I said to these two sergeant majors there one day, I said, when's the last time a general officer looked at your promotion system? One guy looked at the other and said, I've been here 2 years. The other guy said, I've been here 3 years. Said, no generals ever, no colonels ever looked at it. You know, the grinder, just grinding through, nobody getting down and looking at the systems of the Army. See, there are a bunch of systems. The Army is made up, the bureaucratic Army is made up of a tremendous number of systems which operate on sets of rules that occasionally managers have to get in and say, I'm managing, and the system manages the way I tell it to manage as opposed to the way somebody else tells it to manage. One of the things I've learned here and learned in the recruiting service is that people are 99 and 44, 100% good. But if you don't set the standards for them, they'll set their own standards. And that's true in the Army systems business. Civilians will make the rules up, NCOs will make the rules up, a lot of people will make the rules up. If the top management doesn't want to make the rules up, somebody else will make them up. They gotta run them, so they'll make them up. So we got in there, and suddenly the turnaround time began to go better. Who felt good down at Fort Hood, Texas then? Division commanders felt good. Suddenly they looked at, people were here
2 years, 3
for
years.
2 years. Okay, then that brings up another deal. Went down to one, you go out in the field and talk to a guy, go down and see Walt over at Fort Hood, Texas, and he says, there are guys leaving here after being here 6 months. I said, is that right? How in the hell they do that? I said, well, they volunteer to go. So you get out. I said, let me see if I get this straight. Sergeant Thurman comes to work for Captain Ulmer, and Captain Ulmer is a hard ass. And so I can leave the unit and escape you being a hard ass by volunteering to go overseas with only 6 months on the post? He said, that's right. I said, you just gave me a monkey.
Another system.
So another system had worked, so I come back up here and I say, bring me in the rules for the Army's overseas replacement system. Guess what rule number 1 is? If you volunteer to go overseas, no matter how many months you have on stage, you can go overseas. So a guy, for example, a guy could have a bimbo in Korea, go over there for his 13 months, extend for 13 or for another 6 months. The unit commander over there is say, geez, I got to get this guy out of here. He's becoming a bimbo-itis guy on me, and send him back to the United States, and the son of a bitch could volunteer and be back in Korea in a month. Because the system permitted it. So I said, hey, wait a minute, guys, bring me all the rules on this system. And so I said, that rule is dead. You mean you can't volunteer to go overseas? I mean, see, the Milpercent felt good about letting people volunteer to go overseas.
Right.
Because then they didn't have to issue a levy, you follow me? But what they didn't understand was the secondary consequence of that, which was a guy could volunteer out of being in a unit, even if he was, he could tell his boss to go to hell. I don't have to serve in your damn unit, and he'd be gone within a week. We can't have that in the Army. Got to have a level of discipline in the Army. So, changed the system and said, you may volunteer after 1 year. I mean, this threw a lot of civilians and lower grade enlisted guys that worked this kind of stuff in Milpercent. They didn't like that because they were getting over on the Army about that. They'd get their buddies say, where would you like to go? And they said, I'd like to go to Kaiserslautern. Well, if you volunteer, I can
Fix it up.
grease it up for you. Go to Kaiserslautern. So we got that cleaned up. So the NCO deal was a crucial deal. And getting the promotion system straight was crucial to, again, the well-being of the Army about that. And so those things have been fixed, and machinery works now, and essentially we're short spasmodically some grades, but in the main, our people are doing quite well about provisioning the Army with the requisite number of enlisted guys. But at that time, we were short 17,000 people total. We were short about 15,000 NCOs.
We're short 17,000 total, of which 15 were NCOs?
It's two different things.
Yeah.
We're short 17,000 recruits,
Right.
which is in the total end strength of the Army. But in the serving end strength of the Army, those were already on duty. We're short 15,000 NCOs.
Okay, there are 15,000 soldiers who were privates or Spec 4s, and the NCO Corps was short that
Right.
number.
So getting that fixed was a major area. Okay, then, so once we sort of discovered this problem associated with the artillery, then we went through every one of went branch by branch by branch by branch, and we repeated that once a year. So every month we had a new branch come up and tell us what the hell they were doing by branch, in order to make sure we had the right pyramid and the right number of people coming out, being trained, the right recruiting. See, we issued the instructions to the training base, so we had to give them the right instructions, train X number of 98 golfs and Y number of this and the like.
But then, soldiers who were in the branches where the promotion score was 990, they'd be howling like stuck hogs because
You bet.
they'd have to serve 20
You bet.
years as a E4 before
You
they
bet.
make E5.
So what we did was we said, how would you like to transfer to the infantry?
But, yeah.
And the howls dissipated. So what we set up then, we set up, I think it's called a BEAR program, which was a re-enlistment program by MOS. So that those units that were 15% short, you could transfer into. And if you were over an MOS that was over 15%, you could transfer out of. So we would publish that routinely in the Army Times and by otherwise bulletins that would say, if you're in these overskill fields, it would behoove you to take some retraining and go into one of these understrength fields, you might get promoted faster. And a lot of people did that.
So then FADOC had to come into the picture to put together the retraining program.
Yeah, at the NCO level, and they did. Now the, another offshoot of all that, was the business of managing on a monthly basis re-enlistment bonus numbers. So we manipulated re-enlistment bonuses in order to manipulate retention of very high-skilled people, like sergeants of infantry who were in a demand. We needed those guys, so we give them a higher re-enlistment bonus about that. Give you one anecdote about it. The day that President Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers, I raised the re-enlistment bonus on air traffic controllers. That day, I put out a worldwide message that said air traffic controller re-enlistments are now authorized $16,000 for a 3-year tour. I didn't lose a single air traffic controller to the FAA in the year the strike went on. So that shows you how you can manipulate the re-enlistment bonus scheme to effectively cure problems in a given MOS. And once a month I sat down and had all the, Wheeler again and Connolly would bring over the requisite people from Overseas. We sit down and go through every MOS. And we look at how many people are leaving, what the recruiting service is bringing into it, what the training base is turning out, what is the expected re-enlistment rate. Meanwhile, I had put up a PA&E shop in the Des Spur. And it was headed by a lieutenant colonel named Ron Johnston, Johnston. And Ron became my PA&E bird and effectively managed all that.
Is he still on duty?
No, he's in private sector now, retired as a full colonel. And he's in the retired sector. Worked with him, in fact, he and Bob Elton are in business together.
Oh, is he over there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Ron can tell you some tales about Saturdays and Sundays and all that.
That's when I first met you, was on a Sunday morning. So I know about that.
Huh?
I know about that. That's when I first met you, was on a Sunday
Yeah,
morning.
that's why we did this. We had other important business to do during the deal. Okay, now Scheimeyer comes down and, as I recall it, about August of 1981, he says, I want to run an Army Family Symposium. And I said, okay, what are we going to do? He said, well, we're going to let wives tell us what's wrong with the Army. I said, that ought to be exciting work. So we ran the first one, I believe, like in December of 1981. And it turned out to be a gangbusters deal. And out of that, we must have generated 200 tasks.
Were these wives? I mean, what do they do? Volunteer? Where'd you get the wives?
Wives came from every division, post camp, and station in the Army.
Sent a quota around?
Yeah. Came from West Point and all kinds. In fact, a lady that can give you some insights to that sometime is now the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for family members, named Carolyn Beecraft. And Carolyn Beecraft, her husband was, at that time, a major lieutenant colonel in the Army, later a full colonel. And Carolyn was very active in that. And
Was she just a wife at the time?
yeah, she made a living out of that later. She goes into to the National Family Movement and takes an executive position with that, and then she later gets appointed in this administration to that job at the OSC level. So she, I mean,
I've heard
this
of
is
her, yeah.
12 years later, she's still making a living out of this. But at that time, she was a family member. Well, we brought in the Army family thing, and that set off an annual meeting. So that was the first annual meeting. We had onward, second, third, fourth. And every year, the number of issues began to decline. I mean, we really began to work the issues, and we put up a lady in the desk spur shop whose job it was to synthesize all this stuff, and she became the family liaison officer for the chief of staff, but she was lodged in the desk spur. We gave her a small staff, and she worked at hammering out these problems, cross-staff problems about that. That led to the introduction of a course at Fort Leavenworth for battalion and brigade commanders' wives. And the first course that was done out there was done by then Brigadier General Butch Saint. He was the assistant commandant, ran the Command General Staff, deputy commandant, ran the Command General Staff College. And he had the responsibility for bringing in the battalion and brigade commanders. And so we brought in the wives for one of those. And I recall Shai saying, it was voluntary, first go around. Then Shai said, we need to get money to send the wives out there, TDY. So this sort of reminded me of my days as a cadet activities officer again. So we issued invitational travel orders for all the wives to come out there, and they all went out there. And Butch took them under command and control and did a perfect job with them. And then we codified that program, and that program is still an ongoing program. In fact, it's been copied by the other services. So we, the Army, again, Shai's leadership here, I'm the action agent for it, then jumped on by all the commanders and the like. We have led the Army into taking care of families. And Wickham then would follow that very nicely as a chief of staff and keep that going first rate, and Vono following Wickham. And so I would say to you again, Jack Marsh's admonition that as goes the Army, goes the volunteer force, gave a continuing impetus to the Army working not only enlisting the right people, promoting the right people, training the right people during the NCOES and the like, but also in the stabilization of the family in order that the family would feel that it was a good place to live and work, and their husbands then, spouses then, would be encouraged to re-enlist and stay with us. So that was a big program kicked off by Shaw in 1981. The endeavor on leadership, Shaw wanted to ratchet up the leadership in the Army, and that was done as well by Jack Marsh, who decreed that one of his years of, he had the first year was the victory at Yorktown, where he was trying to get a sense of victory and competency back in the Army and the like. And then the next year, I believe, was the year of leadership. So we began a big focus on leadership, and I was a staff officer in charge of that. Of course, I looked at my credentials, which said I was a manager and not a leader. And so I had to go out and create a body of leaders to help me work that particular thing. But we did work that along with the Army War College, along with Leavenworth. And I'd say one of the outgrowths of all that was the fact that we thought we were doing reasonably well in leader development with respect to officers, but we really began to focus on leader development with the non-commissioned officers. And so we were getting TRADOC had brought up well. I don't mean that all of this was created by us in the headship, but I'm just saying the leader focus began to come up, and in so doing, we began to make a considerable push on leader competency in the NCO business and leader competency with junior officers. And it began to change the way in which we trained the people at the lieutenant level and the captain level by having mentors at lieutenant level at OBC, and at the advanced course the same, and began to put together the real heart of the non-commissioned officer courses, which was, okay, you had to have the PLC course down at the sort of the Spec 4 and corporal level, and then a BNOC and an ANOC course, and we already had a Sergeant Major's Academy going at the time. So the leadership was a big angle, involved a lot of people. It was appropriately tended and cared for by people in TRADOC as well as people on the Army staff. And Meyer and Wickham and Bono all put their spins on all that, but we're clearly an organization. And if you think your way through it,
yeah.
most ensigns in the Navy are not leaders.
No.
Most lieutenants in the Air Force are not leaders. But lieutenants in the Army are. And so we have a different obligation and responsibility in the training and the care and feeding of our leaders than we have before. We invested heavily in the pre-command courses and for both the brigade and battalion commanders. So the leader development business began to get a real jump start in that period of time. We've talked about getting the man print in the game and the hardware system. We've talked about the quality of people requisite for manning systems. Talked a little bit about straightening out the career fields. So I guess we jump into core, huh?
Yeah, when did that start? Was 79 the first?
Core?
Right. For studies, wasn't there something that went on in 79?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that maybe today, but I wasn't involved and I was out recruiting. I got into it when Shai said we really want to set up and start running a forward business. And we had a group of people that have been working on it from many different vantage points, I think is the best way to say that. I think people that Rare had been working on it, Walter Reed, Army Institute Research. We had people that ARI had been working on We had people at West Point that have been working on it in the behavioral science laboratory up there. And so, as we began to stabilize the quality of people coming in, and I've done some rudimentary work in the recruiting committee, by going down and doing it sort of.
People at Fort Hood, right?
Doing with people at Fort
Bragg.
Fort McPherson and Fort Bragg, and doing some rudimentary work about that in 1980 and 81 in the recruiting game, with what I call packages or packets.
So you would you recruit people for a specific unit,
Yeah.
and then make a deal with TRADOT?
Well, see, what we were trying to do in 80 and 81 and even 82, we were trying to dream up enough schemes that we would, it didn't make any difference what you wanted to do in the Army. We had something that would meet your objectives, you follow me? And so, for example, we said, if you want to be in the Big Red One, or you want to, you're from Kansas and you want to be in the Big Red One, your daddy was in the Big Red One, it's okay, we'll put you in the Big Red. So, we were trying, if you want to go to the 82nd, we try to get you 82nd. So, one of the early things that I did in the recruiting service was I had a big poster put up for every division. Had the NWR come to grips with it, we published them, they were put out. I mean, you want to sign up in the 82nd, go in there and look at all the divisions. So it'd be a picture of the 82nd, a big parachute, and be little pictures around it, tell you what they did around it. And you look at the Big Red One, the 25th Division, German divisions, Fort Stewart, and any place. So we can get you invested in that. And we went further into that and said, okay, can we put a package together? Would it facilitate you, Cavazos or you, Ulmer, if we brought you groups of 30 people at one fell swoop, you might put them in the same unit to build a little cohesion down there. So we were talking cohesion, but nothing as elaborate or as structured as the Corps system. Now, there had been a couple of British officers, I think, up at the Army War College, who had written, and a couple of U.S. officers, or at least one British officer had been up there, who had written a study about the regimental system and could it apply to U.S. forces. So there was a coming together of a vector on regimental system, a focus on couldn't we put people together for a longer period of times and build internal cohesion, and then couldn't we build units that could be shipped off in terms of spending part of their time in the U.S. and part of their time overseas to better and more equitably do it, and therefore you wouldn't have this constant turmoil of a unit having turnover of 10 to 15% a month like you would in Korea, and in Germany you might have 20% turnover. And people, commanders were remarking that because they were, as we came out of this recruiting doldrum, that gee whiz, a crew turnover was very high, and you couldn't get the same guy on the tank to take it down range 3 times in a row, and so how can we ameliorate turnover in units? There were a variety of vectors that were sort of impinging. So Shai came down one day and said, we'll come down to your office and get a couple of your bright guys, come in there and we'll start talking. So he said, why can't we get a thing where we could recruit guys, bring them in, send them through the training base together, and then put the cadre with them, and then send them to a division. They serve in division for 2 or 3 years, and they can all go overseas together if they want to re-up and go do that. Go work on that. So we got a stable of guys to go work on that. One of the guys is very formative in that is a guy named John Theologus. You know John?
Yes.
Another guy is a tall, chunky, heavy-set guy who was out in the 9th ID with Elton. That Elton later brought in to the business.
Not McGee, is it?
No. And so there's a stable of guys, but I don't remember, the guys I remember is that guy, and I remember John Theologius sort of as principal guys, although there are a number of guys that were involved in all that. And so we began to put together some schemas for doing that. One of the things, it got into an ops research game, okay? What I mean by that, meaning got into an operations research analytical game because you had to be able to predict behaviors. I mean, how many people came in, how many would drop out of training while they were in the recruiting game, or while they were in the training base, how many would get to their first unit, what would be the life of those people in the unit, how many would drop out by month, would you have to reload them at the 6-month period, the 12-month period, the 18-month period. All of those kind of statistical analyses, what would be the re-up rate, had to get looked at on its effect if you made this the case in a unit. I mean, let's just take, for example, if you took a unit like the Big Red One and said we'd do a battalion about that, suddenly you took a battalion's worth of troops that were no longer liable for, therefore somebody else had to go overseas during that period of time. So how do you burden share against other people who are not in those particular units, and are they more likely to have to go overseas and all, you know, I mean, an infinite number of what I call operations analyses in order to try to understand what might be the benefits and what might be the downsides of going to various sundry models about that. We created several different models about it. Then we decided to go and try it out and invoke some of it. And as serendipity would have it, we began it by making some company-size units, and then we moved up to the battalion-size units, and we started with units that seemed to be easy to work with, and that was the light units, particularly in the case of infantry. And figured we could start running battalions, let's say, to the 25th Division, and we could run battalions to the 82nd, we could run battalions to the 9th Division, and then about that time we created the 10th Division, and so we could go do that. So we began this thing with the light guys, knowing that there was less drawdown on the lights for overseas replacements. And if, oh, by the way, you put a battalion into Alaska or into Hawaii, that would reduce the number of overseas replacements you'd have to filter in, because we were levying people out of units in the U.S. to go to
Those places.
to Hawaii and to Alaska, even though they were part of the 50 states, they were considered OCONUS assignments. So we set up this tremendous number of models. Shai would come down, he'd spend hours going through these models, poking at it and all that kind of stuff, and then we'd go through models of how the regimental structure could work and all that, and we spent hours working on that. So he was deeply involved in all that particular stuff. And then we had to go in and get a buy-in with the serving army, and so we took this thing on a roadshow down to Fort McPherson, took it to Germany, took it to the Far East, took it to the divisions, etc., and trying to market the strategy internal to the Army, and out of that all came the sort of the notion, let's move on with the light forces and see how it goes, and then we'll transport to the heavy forces. Now, in all of that, as we began to move it into the heavy forces, we had a steering committee which consisted of the deputy commander of Forces Command, the chief of PERSCOM in Europe, or the Despur of Forces Command, or Despur of Europe, the Despur in Korea, etc. So we had a variety of people that we were fooling with and all those kinds of things. And so whenever you would get a notion like, let's go do it in Europe, you came to the position of, it's a very difficult thing to move people around in Europe in order to set it up. So we decided we would try to go to a place of Europe's choosing to get a start on it. And as I recall it, I could be a little bit off here. You probably maybe know more about it than I do, because you've done some research on it, I believe. But as I recall it, I think we tried to start in maybe Augsburg in Munich, trying to build up a relationship between the second AD4 and the first AD4, so that we could begin to switch some units back from Fort Hood at that time into Europe, and from Fort Riley into Europe. Does that sound right? Tried to set that Garlstadt and Augsburg come to my mind as trying to get that going. And then we tried to move it elsewhere into Europe. Meanwhile, Forces Command look at a variety of things, whether we did it at the company level, whether we did it at the platoon level, whether we did it at the squad level, whether we do it at the battalion level and the like. So a variety of those things are set in train. What worked well was the structure associated with the light divisions, because they were CONUS-based and could be infiltrated and managed pretty well from the point of view of furnishing the troops, and doing the same with both with Hawaii. Hawaii was an easy fix. When you get at the bonding and the cohesion matters internal to the divisions and internal to the companies and battalions, I leave that to a different group of people. I didn't get involved in the evaluation of that. We had Marlowe evaluate that. You helped evaluate that, etc. So you guys know a lot about that. Bob Elton was involved in doing that. I guess my view about it was that it works well in the light, it facilitates the lights, it ought to be done in the lights. Particularly as you go to more CONUS-based units now that the forces are reducing in size, because it reduces the movement of people, and therefore you ought to be able to get a better performance. I mean, it's just intuitively satisfying that if I can get people to stay in my unit better, it'll be a better unit. Turning it over every 10 or 15% every quarter isn't going to promote effectiveness.
No.
And I mean, you don't have to do any analytical work there. Believe that. If you know your trade, you know that's true. So doing it in Europe was difficult, because it disrupted people in Europe, having to pick up a unit, vacate barracks, move from point A to B, and so there was a natural resistance to it in the heavy forces in Europe, and that made the business of doing it back here not appealing to the people, because they were going through heavy levies of people in order to get that done. My own view is that's the way it ought to be done. You ought to train them in the training base together, build the cohesion together, and send them out into the force together. And you ought to be able to accept the uptime and downtime in a unit to do that. Because in the long run, it will promote a better unit. Now, people got all sorts of problems with that, like, gee whiz, you can't promote everybody to sergeant at the same time. You say, that's right, because everybody shouldn't be promoted to sergeant at the same time, because one guy's competencies, well, he can't handle his peer group. And I say, in that case, he shouldn't be promoted. You know, I mean, E4, when he gets promoted to grade E5, can't tell his peer group to do what he wants to get done, then fine, don't promote him. Promote another guy to E5, he can't. But everybody knows if you put 50 people in a unit together, you can identify the top 10% pretty quickly and the bottom 10% pretty quickly. Just waiting for the top 10% to tell them what to do. So, I mean, it's not a question of peer group, it's a question of people's emerging. Leaders will emerge out of all that. So, my general view is cohort is good, it ought to be done, it's a cheap cost, and you get a higher proficiency out of it because you get people staying together longer.
What are the costs? I've heard a lot of moaning and groaning, but I've never had anybody who could spell it out. Did you do the analyses?
Oh, yeah, all the, and a guy like Theologius can show you the cost, dollars and cents. It's been costed.
Yeah, of course.
Whole kit and caboodle about that. And I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna depart here in about 10 minutes, okay? Because I wanna go see Merritt, and then I got an appointment at 3 o'clock. And maybe we ought to figure out when we wanna talk next. This time next week is perfectly okay.
Okay, good for me too. See you then.
That'll be the 8th, right?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Was, during this period, you want to talk for 10 minutes, or
Yeah.
you want to? Was ARI all you wanted it to be while you were des per?
No, but it was a whole lot better than it had been.
Tell me about its history and what the dynamics are of having an in-house.
Well, having an
Search outfit.
in-house thing like that, which is responsive to the, I think it should be responsive to the des per. But that means the des per has got to mind it and feed it, and I minded it and feeded it. And so I was all over it the whole time I was the des per, and so they did some terrific work for me. And they had some very good people at the time doing work. Jacobs in the leadership thing did a lot of work for me. Dave Jacobs did a lot of work for me when I was a des per. Joy Shields did a terrific amount of work for me. She did a study on the effects of people after they got out of the service, how much they appreciated the Army. She did that in a period of about 3 months. It blew Jack Marsh's socks off. The wellspring of goodness about my Army